The Scottish Covenanters. I wonder what pops into your head when you hear those words. Perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps visions of religious fanatics living in self-imposed exile.
Or maybe you have a vague impression that the Covenanters were early, misunderstood advocates of religious freedom. I didn't know much about the Covenanters until I moved up to Scotland to work for the Banner of Truth Trust. What I learned then from the 2-volume History of the Covenanters by J.K. Hewison blew me away. I came to see that the Covenanters were not just overlooked in our national history, but desperately neglected in the Church's own historical consciousness. Many evangelicals have no idea what these brave Scottish Christians suffered for the cause of Christ in their generation. And that is our loss, for they have much to teach us in the darkening times in which we live. In this Banner mini-series, we're going to meet 4 Covenanter martyrs. Through their stories, we'll try to uncover the beating heart of the Covenanter movement and why it matters so much for evangelicals today. We've come here to Edinburgh's Royal Mile, for it was here that the Mercat cross stood. And between 1617 and 1765, public proclamations would be made and public executions would take place. It was here on the 1st of June 1661 that James Guthrie, a Christian minister, was executed for the crime of high treason.
The National Covenant, the document that gives our Covenanters their name, had been signed 23 years earlier, here in Greyfriars Kirkyard. It declared that the Lord Jesus Christ, not the King, had sole authority to rule the Scottish Church, or Kirk.
The people had had enough of the meddling of the Stuart kings with the Church's order and worship. They wanted to worship God according to His word, not the King's preference or diktat. 60,000 people turned up here to sign the National Covenant on the 28th of February 1638, and an estimated further 240,000 people put their names to it in subsequent years. But the period that followed its signing had been turbulent, to say the least. In 1649, the Stuart king, Charles I, had been executed, to the dismay of most Scots, including the Covenanters. Yes, the Covenanters opposed the king's desire to rule in the Kirk, but that didn't mean that they wanted him dead. Least of all, dead at the hands of the English.
The 1650s saw a long struggle between the next in line for the Stuart throne, Charles II, and Oliver Cromwell's parliamentary armies. The Covenanters would be caught in the crossfire. It soon became hard to disentangle the cause of Scotland's Reformation and Covenant from the political fortunes of the Stuart kings and their opponents. It was easy to lose one's footing. In this context, the Presbyterian pastor James Guthrie would come to be known as Sycharfoot or Surefoot. Here was a man who knew what was worth living for, and, as it turned out, what was worth dying for as well. His could be a steady hand at the helm.
To understand James Guthrie, we must realize that his great concern was the spiritual well-being, the righteousness of his own congregations, first in Lauder, Midlothian, south of Edinburgh, and then later in Stirling, north of the capital. By extension, he cared enormously about the spiritual well-being of his country and did all he could to ensure that church and state were being run in a way that pleased the Lord and served the people. The events of the 1650s would test that commitment to the limit, as the Covenanters divided into two camps: the Resolutioners, who called for peace with Charles II and an acceptance of his supporters in Scottish public life, and the Protesters, who believed Charles to be duplicitous and false in his commitment to the Covenanters. Protesters, and Guthrie was one of them, believed that if the covenant meant anything at all, then it must be signed in earnest and upheld by the king and by all his subjects. Guthrie, a true Covenanter, opposed the king's attempts to establish his authority over the Kirk. But he wasn't in Cromwell's pocket either, and in 1657, against the Cromwellian sectaries, he actually argued for the legitimacy of Charles II's reign. And this is really important. The Covenanters were not anarchists or rebels at heart, and James Guthrie exemplified this in his calm and dignified manner. Here was a man who maintained two things most clearly. First, that Charles II had a right to rule as a king appointed by God, and second, that Charles II had no divine commission to rule in the church, the Kirk. His was a government that was strictly limited, and limited by God. Alas for Guthrie, the king had no time for those unwilling to grant him power in all causes. The full restoration of Charles II to the throne in 1661 spelled the end for James Guthrie, and the beginning of a time of great difficulty for all faithful Covenanters. He was arrested for failing to acknowledge Charles's full supremacy and for teaching the independence of Christ's Kirk from the jurisdiction of the Stuart kings. After a trial which made a mockery of justice, the king's agents determined to make him an example to anyone tempted to qualify their allegiance to the crown. James Guthrie was sentenced to death by hanging. His coat of arms was to be torn and dishonoured. His wife and children, Willie and Sophia, made beggars forever. During his imprisonment, he had opportunities to escape the hangman's noose. He implies in his last speech that he could have escaped, both from arrest and from imprisonment at different points. But he knew that would cast aspersions on his behaviour and his innocence. Desiring above all to witness for the Lord Jesus and the covenanted work of reformation, he chose to suffer rather than sin. In his final days, he wrote many letters, including a most touching one to his wife, the text of which is linked below. After his final dinner with friends, he called for cheese, which he was fond of but had to avoid because of painful kidney stones. By this point, he said, he was beyond the hazard of kidney stones. On the 1st of June, his hands bound, Guthrie was marched down the Royal Mile from Edinburgh Castle to this spot. Mounting the scaffold, he addressed the crowd. "Christ is my light and my life, my righteousness, my strength and my salvation. He is also my salvation, and all my desire is in him. I do with all the strength of my soul commend him to you. Blessed are they that are not offended in him." Sure-footed in life, James Guthrie, the great first martyr of the covenant, was strengthened by God's grace in death.
After his execution, Guthrie's body was given to friends in waiting, but his head was suspended on a pike at the Netherbow Port, one of the great gates to the old city of Edinburgh. There it stood as a warning to anyone unwilling to grant that King Charles was head of the church as well as the state.
Here, on the corner of High Street and Geoffrey Street, you can still make out the outline of the Netherbow Port Gatehouse, which was demolished in 1764. Guthrie's head was witnessed regularly by his young son, little Willie Guthrie. who would run home and hide away for hours, saying, when found, "I've seen my father's head." A good man was dead, a family torn apart, a wife left destitute, and 2 children left fatherless. Perhaps Willie Guthrie called to mind words that his father spoke to him on the day he was executed. "Willie, the day will come when they will cast up to you that your father was hanged. But be not thou ashamed, lad. It is in a good cause." From what we can tell, Willie followed in his father's footsteps, studying hard, aiming for the suffering church ministry. But it was not to be. He sickened and died while yet a young man. He would see his father in glory even before his father's head was given decent and honourable burial. The Guthrie family took their place among those who, from biblical times to the present day, have paid dearly for their allegiance to the true King, the Lord Jesus Christ. And here, in Greyfriars Kirkyard, Guthrie's martyrdom is commemorated in lines that pay tribute to the Covenanters.
But as for them, no cause was to be found worthy of death, but only they were sound, constant and steadfast, zealous, witnessing for the prerogatives of Christ their King, which truths were sealed by famous Guthrie's head, and all along to Mr. Rennick's blood. They did endure the wrath of enemies, reproaches, torments, deaths, and injuries. But yet they're those who from such troubles came, and now triumph in glory with the Lamb.
In the years following the killing of James Guthrie, the Scottish government would harden its stance and ramp up its use of force against the Covenanters. What that oppression led to is the subject of our next video, which you can watch here. If you'd like to learn more about the Covenanters, see the links to some of the books we publish on them in the description.